We lock our doors at night to create a sanctuary. We tell ourselves that the walls protect us from the darkness outside. But a lock is only a delay, not a guarantee. From a whistling stalker who arrives with terrifying precision at 1:17 a.m., to strangers luring children into a forest that doesn't exist, and a silent figure standing inches from the glass, humming along to your television. Here are 3 true, bone-chilling horror stories that will make you never want to look out your window again. Let's begin. Welcome to Mr. Specter's channel. Story 1, The Whistling Walker. My name is Evan, and I am 28 years old. After my divorce, I relocated to a small town named Chatham in Alabama. Aside from my parents' house, I didn't really have anywhere else to go, so I decided to live in my grandfather's old house. He passed away a few years ago and left the property to our family. It is situated about 10 minutes outside of town, sitting on 10 acres of land surrounded by dense woods. It is incredibly quiet out there. I thought I would enjoy the solitude. The house itself is old, with wood floors that creak and doors that stick, the kind of place that always feels a little cold no matter how high you crank up the thermostat. But it was free, and I didn't have a better option. The first few nights were normal. I unpacked and cleaned. I spent the evenings sitting on the porch with a beer. It was peaceful, no traffic, just the sound of the wind moving through the trees and the occasional hoot of an owl. But then, the noises started. The first time I heard it was on the 7th night. I had just gotten into bed around midnight and was drifting off to sleep when I heard whistling outside. It wasn't a recognizable song, just a slow, broken tune, completely off-key. It sounded like someone walking through the woods behind the house, whistling as they went. It unsettled me, but I rationalized it as a hunter or perhaps a drunk neighbor taking a shortcut. The next night, it happened again. Same time, same tune, but this time, it sounded closer. I climbed out of bed and flipped on the porch light, but I didn't see anyone. I grabbed a flashlight and checked the yard. Nothing. No tracks, no sounds of anyone running away. Just the whistling, fading deeper into the woods. I tried to ignore it. For a couple of nights, I just stayed in bed and tried to force myself to sleep. But every single time, the whistling would start around 1:17 a.m. I know that sounds like a random time, but I swear, it was always between 1:15 and 1:19. It was like clockwork. I began to suspect someone was messing with me on purpose, someone who knew I was out there alone. A few days later, I called the sheriff's office. An older deputy, whom I'll call Deputy H, came out to the property. He had been on the job for a long time. When I explained what was happening, his demeanor changed. He became very quiet. He looked at me and said, word for word, "Your granddaddy used to call us about the same thing." He told me my grandfather claimed someone was whistling around the property late at night, always in the spring. They never found anyone. I had assumed my grandfather was just getting senile in his old age, but hearing that from the deputy shook me. I had no idea my grandfather had dealt with this. Deputy H advised me to keep the doors locked and stay inside after dark. I started doing exactly that, double-checking every window. One night, I even wedged chairs under the doorknobs, but the whistling continued, getting closer every night. One evening, I heard it directly behind the shed. It was louder than usual, as if the person was standing right there. I grabbed my flashlight and peered through the blinds. I didn't see anyone, but I didn't dare go outside. The next night, I heard it from the front porch, right by the door. 3 long whistles, then silence. The night after that, I swear to God, it sounded like it was coming from under the floorboards. It was as if someone was in the crawlspace, whistling up through the vents. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next day, I started digging through the attic, trying to find anything my grandfather might have left behind. I found a box of his journals. He wrote about the whistling. He noted that it happened every spring for over 10 years. He didn't know who it was, but he believed it was someone watching the house. He wrote about sitting up with a rifle by the front door, just in case. He mentioned it only ever happened when he lived alone, after my grandmother died. I called Deputy H again. He came by, read the journal, and looked visibly nervous. He told me to be extremely careful and not to open the door if I didn't know who it was. That night, I stayed up. I sat on the couch with a shotgun across my lap, a weapon I barely knew how to load. I waited. At 1:17 a.m., the whistling started again, but this time, it didn't come from outside. It came from the hallway, inside the house. I froze. The hallway light was off. I could hear the source of the whistling moving closer, step by step. I stood up, aimed a shotgun into the darkness, and shouted, "Who's there?" The whistling stopped instantly. I flipped the hallway light switch. Nothing was there. No one. I didn't sleep again after that. For 2 nights following that incident, I didn't hear it. I was becoming physically ill from the stress. I didn't know who this person was, why they picked me or my grandfather, but I knew it was real. I don't believe in hallucinations to that degree, nor do I believe in the paranormal. This was a real person. After 2 days of silence, I thought maybe it was finally over. On the 3rd night, I went to bed just after midnight. I left the hallway light on, just in case. At exactly 1:17 a.m., I woke up to a new sound. Not whistling. Knocking. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. They were coming from inside the house, from the back door. Then silence. I didn't move. I lay in bed, listening. A minute later, I heard a floorboard creak in the hallway. Then another. Someone was walking. Suddenly, the hallway light went out. I grabbed my shotgun, heart pounding against my ribs, and stepped out of the bedroom. The hallway was pitch black, but at the end of it, I saw a silhouette. A person, wearing black clothes with a pale face, standing perfectly still, just watching me. I raised the shotgun, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I tried to speak, but my mouth was bone dry. I screamed, "Don't move," with a trembling voice. In the dark, I saw the person slowly lift their leg and turn, as if preparing to run. I screamed stop, but at that moment, they darted out of the hallway and out of my line of sight. I heard heavy footsteps stomping out the front door into the night. I ran outside and fired a shot, not into the air, but straight ahead into the darkness, hoping to hit the intruder. I screamed, "Don't come back." The gunshot rang in my ears, ricocheting off the walls of the house and the deck. I locked up the house, jumped into my truck, and drove into town. I slept in my truck that night. The next morning, Deputy H drove out to the property. The front door was unlocked again, confirming that whoever it was had a key to my grandfather's house. Nothing was stolen or broken, but Deputy H recommended I change the locks immediately. Off the record, he suggested I move out, saying that someone in those woods clearly hadn't taken kindly to either my grandfather or me being there. I drove to the hardware store and changed the locks within the hour. Shortly after, I left the house and went to stay with my parents out of state. I left it to my dad to eventually sell the place. We removed anything of sentimental value, and the rest was sold or left behind. My father, naturally, omitted the fact that some creep had been stalking the property for decades. How they got a key, Who they were, and why my grandfather never spoke of it remains a mystery that disturbs me deeply. I believe it was a disturbed individual living nearby, but the experience left me too unsettled to ever live in a remote location again. Story 2: The Mint Field. I am 16 years old and live in the city now, but I spent the first 8 years of my life in the countryside. To some, it might seem strange that I was allowed to walk around the village unsupervised at such a young age, but the area was very small. The entire population was about 90 people maximum. Basically, everyone knew everyone, to the point that my friends and I recognized cars and knew exactly who they belonged to. It was a hot summer day. My friend, whom I'll call Julian, and I were desperate for some Coca-Cola. Back then, soda was cheap at the local markets, and we were scraping together pennies to buy 2 cans. Luckily, an elderly neighbor called out to us from her house. She explained that she wanted to make mint tea for her upcoming birthday but had run out of fresh mint. She offered us a deal: if we filled 2 plastic bags with mint leaves, she would buy us as much soda as we wanted. Julian and I thought it was a fantastic idea, as I didn't want to ask my parents for money. We started searching immediately. The sun was beating down on our foreheads, and our clothes were soaked in sweat. We searched everywhere for mint, but despite our efforts, we barely filled half of the first bag. We were frustrated, knowing we wouldn't gather enough before sundown. Still, we kept walking, hoping for a miracle, a field full of plants. Suddenly, 2 tall guys approached us out of nowhere. To our 7-year-old eyes, they seemed like giants, though they were probably around 5 feet 7 inches. What surprised me most was that they were covered in black clothes, large hoodies and tight pants, despite the scorching heat. Neither looked older than 17, though it was hard to make out their features. They spoke to us in a friendly, almost childish tone, their words carefully chosen to avoid suspicion. "Are you kids both alone?" Julian looked at me with worry and signaled with his hand for us to leave. Unfortunately, I wasn't good at reading body language, so I didn't understand what he wanted. I shifted my attention back to the strangers and spoke cheerfully. "Yeah, we're actually looking for some mint plants. Do you know where we can find a bunch? We've been looking for so long and we're really tired." I recall a flashback of one of the guys smirking when he heard what we were looking for. One of them crouched next to me and patted my head. Julian immediately stepped closer, pulling me back by my arm. His expression was serious, almost panicked. He asked, "Who are your parents?" Where I come from, asking who someone's parents are is a common way to identify their family line, since the population is so small. Julian, having been born in the countryside, knew the locals better than I did. He was scared because he didn't recognize these guys. The fact that they were talking to 2 small kids alone and touching my head sent up immediate red flags for him. Just as he feared, they avoided the question, acting as if I were their main interest. "Actually, I've seen a big field of mint," one said. "You see that hill over there? That's where we come from. If you want, we could lead you to the field and help you fill those bags, or even more." We knew that hill. Julian, the other kids, and I used to play hide-and-seek in that forest, and it was great fun. But not once had I ever seen a mint field there. The only things that grew on that hill were corn, grapes, and watermelons. Being a naive kid, I ignored the warning signs. I nodded eagerly, pulling Julian by the arm to follow them. The guys seemed satisfied and began to lead the way. We walked further and further away from the village. I could feel Julian's hand trembling in mine. A sudden shiver went down my spine as I realized the village was no longer visible. The forest was right in front of us, and there was no trace of mint anywhere. I asked the guys where we were going, but they gave vague answers like, "You'll see," or "Just be patient." I began to sweat from fear and slowed my pace. Panic rushed through my veins. I realized something bad was about to happen, but I couldn't stop walking. I felt that if we tried to step back, the situation would turn violent. Then, Julian leaned close to my ear and whispered as quietly as he could, "I still get chills remembering it. There's something wrong with these two. Run." That was the last thing I heard before Julian began sprinting downhill like crazy, his hand never breaking contact with mine. I ran as if my life depended on it, and it probably did. I could hear the two guys cursing behind us, and they started to give chase. I was crying loudly from fear but didn't stop. I don't know how I managed to run nearly 2 kilometers back to the village without a break or a breath. The woman who had sent us on the errand saw us, covered in tears and sweat, our faces pale as ghosts. The pursuers must have stopped following us as we got closer to the houses. She took us inside and gave us chocolate to calm us down. Julian explained what happened, as I was too paralyzed to speak. The woman scolded us, mostly Julian, because he lied and said I didn't want to follow them and that he had insisted on trusting the guys. He wasn't allowed to play outside for a month, while I needed time to recover from the trauma. I never found out who those guys were or what they wanted. Looking back as an adult, I can guess, and it makes me sick. Running downhill at that speed was risky. I could have easily tripped. If it wasn't for Julian, who is now my boyfriend, I don't want to imagine what those strangers would have done to us. Story 3: The Watcher in the Woods. My parents worked constantly when I was little. They both held 2 jobs to support me and my older brother, Cameron. Their schedule required them to be gone most of the time, so they hired a babysitter through a website. She was a young woman in her early 20s named Michelle. For about 4 or 5 months, Michelle came over every weekday. Since I was 7 and Cam was 8, we loved having her around. She was polite, energetic, and played with us, unlike older sitters who were often tired. Cam and I did online schooling, and Michelle helped with that too. When summer arrived, my parents told Michelle to take a break and enjoy a vacation. This meant we didn't have a babysitter for the summer. Rather than finding someone new, my parents decided to take Cam and me to our grandparents' house. They lived in the countryside of Texas, which was a long drive from our home in Oklahoma, but we would be there all summer. We started our drive on a Saturday. To my child self, the ride was boring and nauseating, but we finally arrived at the medium-sized cabin located in a large open field backed by woods. There was a barn-style building nearby for the animals, cows, goats, and chickens. We said our hellos, and Grandpa immediately took Cam and me on a tour. My parents stayed inside with Grandma as she cooked dinner. The evening was wonderful. We played with their dog, Cora, and caught up with family. When it was time for bed, my brother and I shared a room with a bunk bed and a TV. My parents slept in the room next door. They fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the drive and needing to return to work the next day. Cam and I stayed up watching cartoons before finally falling asleep with the TV on. Around 2 a.m., I was woken by the sound of heavy footsteps outside my window. I couldn't see out because the blinds were drawn. The footsteps didn't wake Cam, but I heard them clearly. Then came a weird noise at the window, followed by a grunt. Someone was trying to open it. I ran to wake my parents. They didn't really believe me, dismissing it as my imagination, but they checked anyway. Finding nothing, they brushed it off as an animal. We were in the middle of nowhere, after all. I eventually fell back asleep. In the morning, the smell of Grandma's breakfast woke me up. My parents ate with us and then left for home. Afterward, Grandpa took Cam and me to feed the animals and walk Cora. I asked to hold Cora's leash. As we walked along the trail, I found myself having to tug on the leash every few seconds. Finally, I looked back to see why she wasn't moving. She was staring intensely into the woods. I was scared to look, but when I did, I saw a black figure standing there, staring at us. Even though he was dressed entirely in black, I could tell he was watching us. He was standing half behind a tree, hands resting on the wood, peeking out with his whole body. I turned to tell my grandpa, but he and Cam were 15 feet ahead. I ran to catch up, dragging Cora, but by the time I told him, the man had vanished. It was like he was never there. My grandpa, knowing about the incident the night before, looked concerned but tried to reassure me that it was probably a deer I had scared off. We spent the rest of the day watching movies and playing in the sprinklers. That night, Grandma made a huge dinner. Exhausted from eating and playing, I took a quick bath and went straight to our room. We watched cartoons again and fell asleep. Around 1 a.m., I was woken up by humming outside the window. The terrifying part was that the person was humming the theme song to Cyber Chase, the show currently playing on our TV. Cam slept through it, and the blinds were still closed, so I couldn't see out. But I knew for sure it was a person. At first, I hoped it was my grandpa smoking outside, humming along because he heard the TV. But then I realized the humming was too close, right against the glass, watching and listening to us sleep. I hope you enjoyed the content. For more videos, subscribe to our channel and activate the bell.